as you can see, is a high engagement and long-term approach to social investment, which encompasses three pillars: tailored financing, non-financial support, as well as impact measurement. And our membership encompasses a spectrum of investment approaches, including grant making with no financial return, as well as social investment. And we believe that venture philanthropy has a key role to play in unlocking alternative financing for innovation, in particular by enabling risk-taking, which governments who handle public money can often be reluctant to engage in. So in that sense, we believe that philanthropy and government can achieve together what neither can alone.
Thank you very much. So now that we know a little bit more about some alternative source of finance, can we understand, or can we, could you shed some light as regards to the market size, and I mean, how much those alternative of finance suppliers are bringing into the European market?
I should start. Maybe I can start about online alternative finance. So it's a very strange market in a way. It's very hard to assess what's the general size of it. So, but I'm going to try a bit. So when it goes for alternative finance in general, it's more or less between 4 and, I have to use my notes, 4 and 5 billion euros, according to different reports. And out of this, we try to assess how much of it goes actually to research and innovation. It's only around 750 million euros. So that's not much and much in a way, because if you talk about Horizon 2020, the overall budget, it's something around 1/10 of the Horizon, no 1/10, 1/12 of the Horizon 2020 budget. Of the annual budget, but still it's not much, and especially if we talk about how it compares to all the other countries and all the other regions. So I'm going to use a little bit of my notes to show you, to tell you the examples. So if we talk about Europe and we have let's say between 4 and 5 billion euros. When it goes for alternative finance. As a comparison, America, it's around 20 billion euros, and Asia Pacific, it's right now around 95 billion euros. So that's quite a big difference. So you can see that Europe is actually lagging behind a lot. And on top of that, the growth, because the alternative market finance market is growing really fast, but the growth is actually decreasing in Europe as compared to acceleration in other regions. So that's a little bit worrying. But still, the alternative finance can be used to support innovative companies. And one more thing maybe about the size of the market, because I mentioned that there are different kinds of online alternative finance. What is a little bit different when it goes for a general trend and a trend for research and innovation, all in all, the biggest market for alternative finance is peer-to-peer lending. But when it goes for research and innovation, it's actually equity that is the biggest. And it's the one that grows overall the fastest. So that's a little bit of a difference. And of course, research and reward-based crowdfunding is also important right now.
Thank you. And okay, so this is online alternative suppliers of finance only. So what about business angels and in the venture philanthropy domain? What's the market size and investments?
Well, for business angels, I think you included some of the numbers I mentioned a little bit before. We estimate that there's a couple 100,000 individuals where, for example, in Europe, there could be at least 10 million individuals who could be business angels, especially now with some of the platforms where you can still get educated. So it's not betting, but you can start with 2,000 euros per investment. So you can build a nice portfolio about 20,000. And then in total, it's around several billion that we estimate high level, and the overlap between kind of what's done on crowdfunding through angel networks or through individual angels is hard to measure, but we estimate that it's within the numbers that you mentioned.
Maybe we can add one thing, because I think it's very interesting. I forgot to mention that alternative finance, online alternative finance is very often, so what we observed, maybe you can confirm or not, business angels very often validate the product, and the rest of the deal is done, so source the deal kind of through crowdfunding, and the rest of the deal is done outside of alternative finance markets. So basically, these are estimations, as we don't know what's the real size of the deal. But,
very briefly, so in venture philanthropy, there's 880 million euros being invested on average per year. Since EVPA started conducting its industry survey in 2012, so over the past 5 years, the cumulative size of the sector is 6.5 billion euros. However, so this is substantial. However, it's a small drop in the ocean, really a grain of sand still in comparison to global capital flows overall. If you look at just foundations, they invest 150 billion. Just foundations. So venture philanthropy is definitely growing. However, it's still very, very small.
Thank you. So the fact that those suppliers are actually new in the market, it means that from time to time they encounter some barriers, some regulatory barriers, but also administrative barriers. Can you explain us what are the typical regulatory barriers that they find out, and some policy recommendations that policymakers could, at the national level, but also at the European level, could take into account in order to facilitate the business within the nation, within the member state, but also supporting cross-border investment?
Okay.
Matthew?
I think one major barrier is obviously the regulations, the legislation and the regulation in place. Not all countries have crowdfunding. If I speak about crowdfunding specifically, not all countries in Europe have a tailor-made or a specialized crowdfunding legislation. Malta is one of them. For example, we operate on a reward-based model yet. We are pushing to be able to go into equity and lending, but we can't yet, so we'll need the legislation to be in place in order for us to operate in those fields. And that is obviously one major barrier. The recommendation there obviously is to look into regulation as a, even in light of cross-border, to look into maybe a pan-European legislation where it is lightweight and simple, to be able to obviously leave it as an affordable source of financing, because you can't add too much burdens on the platforms in order for them to remain sustainable and have crowdfunding as one of the affordable options for financing. Together with regulations, the licensing requirements. Again, various countries use the sort of the gold plating option on certain, like the MiFID rules, for licensing, so it adds another complexity for platforms to operate cross-border. So one option is to actually look also for regulators to use the concept of sandboxing or creating modular legislation that people can actually pick and use areas that they want to operate in. This is also in line with potential future alternative financing models that we don't know yet what they will be, even in line with the major advancements in fintech and artificial intelligence, where robo-advisors start coming into play. So there's also the landscape of alternative financing is constantly changing. So the regulation the regulators need to set up a framework that will allow them to catch up as much as possible. Obviously, then other barriers are, if not sort of to try and keep it short, are the skills. It requires a different set of skills. Entrepreneurs, researchers, innovators are focusing on the work, on the innovation, on the research that they want to do. So the building up skills for sourcing financing, going online with their pitch requires a certain level of skills that they might not have. Also, when you're dealing with cross-border, there's an element as well of different cultures. We mentioned there isn't one package, one pitch or one investment that will attract interest from everywhere because of different cultures, different languages, and also geographic issues that people tend to participate and be involved in something which is close to them geographically.
Brigitte.
To build on what was just said, first of all, I want to commend the EU because about 10 years ago, I was president in EBAN, the European Trade Association for Business Angels and Angel Networks. And we had made kind of a wish list of what we saw as things that would really make a big difference. And quite a few, and that's what's been discussed today, quite a few are starting to be in place. The first one was all about making sure that as we're supporting to have a lot more entrepreneurs, equal amount is done to get a lot more people like me to dare to allocate some of their wealth towards being angel investors, whether you do it through a platform or other ways, but that you're supporting the entrepreneurs' equity or money and support. And so a lot of the initiatives that are now and in the coming years are towards that, and a project like ISO, which is really a benchmark of helping to build awareness and education, because before people just send their money, they really have to understand what they're getting into this kind of asset class. So more work needs to be done, but that's in place. The second thing that was viewed is that often we as angels, and especially when we become a lead angel and a experienced angel, we really need support for follow-on rounds, etc. And I think we're seeing there's more and more schemes. Again, that's a big topic of today, various schemes, and luckily more and more of the public-private schemes are to co-invest alongside individuals like me and angel groups, rather than public organizations thinking they can evaluate entrepreneurs and they know what entrepreneurs are good or not good. So those are the two things that are great. The last two things that I would say would be on our wish list, in addition to what you mentioned, is now that more individuals want to invest, but they realize they need to build a portfolio, or else if you only do 1 or 2 investments, it's really like lottery, and you need about 1,000 tickets to make sure that you really hit it, or 10 tickets to make sure you hit it right and in the right startups. We really need really simple ways to create syndicates. So if if all of us wanted to make an investment, but let's say there's 50 of us, the entrepreneur does not want to have 50 people on their cap table, especially when there's time to an exit. And we want something, we don't want to have to set up a big heavy-duty legal infrastructure just to make some investments. And that does not, on a pan-European level, tax transparent, simple to do, and for Malta, as you're doing new legislation, you can be a leader in that. That does not exist very well yet, and all crowdfunding platforms or angel platforms like us have that challenge. And the next one is that more and more people now recognize that since you need to build a portfolio and you need to to reinvest in some of the deals, they don't want to just do deal by deals. They want to do multiple deals at the same time. And most of the legislation is pretty good for deal by deal, but it's not good when, you know, again, all of us might say, hey, let's put money, a little bit of money in a pot and let's do 6 investments. The legislation's not there yet. So it seems that those to us would be the next 2 things that would be great to have.
Thank you. Susanna?
So in terms of social investment, the main policy recommendations are contained in the report of the expert group of the European Commission on social entrepreneurship, which contains 13 recommendations overall, including 1 chapter on access to financing. And the policy direction there is very much about recognizing the diversity of financing needs in terms of social enterprises based on the specificities of their operations, but also on the maturity of the organization, as well as recognizing the diversity of financing instruments that are available. And the main recommendations are about unlocking public and private capital for social entrepreneurship. And so on the supply side, it's about capacity building initiatives, so making social enterprises be more investment ready. On the demand side, removing barriers, as was mentioned, not only domestically but also to cross-border social investments, as well as in building incentives, particularly in the field of tax and fiscal, and creating fiscal incentives for these types of social investments. And then finally, more public funding initiatives, maintaining and continuing initiatives such as we've heard about throughout today at the European and national levels in order to complement and de-risk private financing. So overall, we see a need in venture philanthropy to mainstream this type of investing, and this can happen through policy measures that increase visibility and understanding of what social investment and social enterprise are, and also political ownership at the EU level, which we've seen a lot and hope to continue seeing going forward.
Maybe I can add one more thing about online alternative finance for research and innovation, because we talked, you mentioned a lot of recommendations concerning alternative finance in general, and there are some specific needs. One, maybe one that I can add to yours, is the transparency of platforms operation. That's a big deal. We have a lot of platforms, even for research. So in general, in Europe, there's over 500 alternative finance platforms. There is around 232 platforms that are related to research and innovation. So either generic with innovation, R&I aspect, or just research and innovation oriented. Not many of them are very big. Some of them are super, super small, and not all of them are reliable. The problem is, especially for innovation and research, it's really hard to distinguish which platform is good and which is not. And the MiFID license is not a solution, because right now only three crowdfunding platforms in Europe are big enough to have this license, and 3 or 4 right now that obtain this license. So there is a need of some kind of a system, first of all, for transparency of platforms operations, so that people really believe in the platform and are sure that it's a reliable platform. Secondly, some kind of a guidance on the quality of platform. It goes for research and innovation, and especially in the area of science, because it's a kind of difficult subject, and you need to have a specific knowledge. So you have to rely on the know-how of experts, and there need to be some scientific board that checks the projects before, and you need to be sure that there are really good experts involved. So there is a need of this quality stamp in a way, in one way or the other. The other thing that's more for innovation and science. But the other thing for research only is the financial education, because actually when it goes for research institutions, they are not aware of alternative finance at all. They don't want to touch it. They don't know how to deal with it, how to combine it with grants. What does it really mean, and what does it entail? So there is a need for very basic things like financial education, like some kind of information package for them. Yeah.
And do you have specific cases where alternative suppliers of finance have been supporting innovative SMEs? Could you share some best cases or with the audience?
Yeah, from our perspective, we are a startup ourselves, so the platform is relatively new in Malta. The concept of crowdfunding is also relatively new, so we're currently working on building more of a pipeline for these ideas in terms of research and innovation. So we're working on developing tools, schemes such as match funding, and leveraging on the media exposure and the hype around alternative financing and crowdfunding to leverage on, and as well making science, research and innovation more popular to attract more people into the field, because success stories make people aware of the options and are attracted to the field. In our case, we've been operating for a year and a few months now. We have quite a good, healthy success rate, and in fact, if to mention two examples, we had a research project based on robotics, as well as a project on environmental sustainability, where prototyping of a product to clean up animal waste and converting it back to usable products. So they were small products, but as I said, we're also new ourselves. So I think there's only room for growth, and the opportunities are there. We just need to be able to tap into them and have resources ourselves to help others tap into them. But yes, in a relatively short period of time, the successes started coming up already.
So on our platform, we started in 2008, and there's been 20 million invested in 60 companies, 130 rounds of financing, because once members of our community invest, we really help the entrepreneur up until exit. And the great news is pretty much it's a third year in a row. And again, this is, you talk about data, that's why we're totally transparent. We show exactly everyone in the platform how their portfolios are doing. And it's the third year in a row where pretty much as much of what the community invested has been cashed out, which is very rare in these things. And 80% of the investors, of which 50% had never been angel investors before, have neutral or positive annualized return. And so we analyze, why is it that some have every single year 20-30% annualized return, whereas the average is around 10% annualized return, which is still great compared to other asset classes right now. But what we see is that the most successful entrepreneurs are those who we work with, and then once we're with them, they end up getting EU support, or whether it's or national support, and then they add other forms of financing, because we can really, like you said, on the education, we can really help them. Where we've had a few challenges is through EU projects, we met a number of startups, but who had up to now only gotten money through EU research grants, and they ended up being really great researchers, but actually didn't really necessarily want to become big companies who then would be acquired. So that's some of the little bit negative experience we had, is that if for too many years they really depended on just kind of grant money or research money from the public sector, then their entrepreneurial spirit wasn't the same as some who would start and then would supplement our financing with some with rewards financing and some research grants, but then they started with a core of entrepreneurship passion, and then they added the other forms of financing.
Maybe one example that was shared actually during the same conference last year. I don't know if a lot of you remember it. There was a panel on crowdfunding, and there was a project called PeerBuy. It's also from the circular economy sector. From the Netherlands, they crowdfunded through One Planet Crowd, and it was an amazing success. Within 4 days, they managed to gather 2 million euros, which was like they over-exceeded the initial target by 4 or 5 times. And that shows that it's possible. That was not the initial round, that was the second round of financing for them. They wanted to cover the market, the financial gap that they had before going to another round of financing. And yeah, it's a real success story, and it also shows how important is the good business plan, good preparation, good communication plan when it goes for online alternative finance. But yeah, that was one story. The second one, very short, from more research scientific field, is ocean cleanup project that gathered money for the new way of gathering plastic, getting rid of plastic, gathering plastic in the oceans and getting rid of it. And they also managed to gather 2 million euros, which is what was interesting there. I think they started it before the crowdfunding was so popular. They decided to do it through their own webpage. So they created the crowdfunding page for themselves. But there is one issue, and they were super successful. There is one issue that shows a little bit what's the problem here in Europe. They actually did it through the US affiliation. I think they moved. They set up this website in New York, so it's so that it's easier for them due to tax reasons and other regulatory burdens. But yeah.
So indeed, I mean, as we have heard, there are some regulatory barriers. There is also, from what we've heard, kind of a lack of knowledge of what implies, how to make it happen. There is also a lack of information, not only about the possibilities that those alternative suppliers of finance do have, but also information on how to be part of this new movement. One of the solutions that the European Commission is proposing is a new call, which is currently open for proposals, where we would like to build capacity for those alternative suppliers of finance that want to improve. But also, the idea is that we have seen that traditional suppliers of finance are actually more interested in changing their business model, understanding new business opportunities, so collaborations are taking place. This is the aim of this new call. It will be open until the 7th of September this year, so we would like to receive as much as possible, I mean, different proposals in order to help, I mean, all those providers of alternative finance to overcome the different, let's say, bottlenecks that do have in the European market. So having said so, I would like also to give the opportunity to the audience to launch, to pose some questions before we close this first day of the Innovative Enterprise Week here in Malta. We have one question there.
Thank you. I'd like to direct it to you, Bridget. You mentioned that you went through a period of education on your way to become a successful angel investor. What are the key rules that govern your investment behavior?
So the first thing is realizing angel investing is an art. It's also a science, and it's also a lot of psychology. And from that base, and again, a lot of this comes from the data that we get. If you go-beyond.biz, B-I-Z, you'll see the latest one that was just published last week. And what we find is that there's really successful angel investors. There's 4 things. One is that, of course, you start with good deal flow. So we talked about investor-ready entrepreneurs, and there's really a right time for angels to come into the life of an entrepreneur. And that usually means being really plugged in local entrepreneurial ecosystems. The second is that when you do due diligence, it's really great to, one, be part of a community where you can share experiences. That's one element of crowd, but also if it's in a certain sector, to have access to a couple people who know well those trends, and a service provider that can kind of benchmark the deals. So that's number 2, how you do the due diligence. Don't spend too much time, but enough. The third is really about realizing that it's all about building a portfolio. The third is once you've made that base of investments, how do you make sure you're in a community where there's always at least one investor who is staying close, who is the point of contact, often on the board, that then can come back to the community of investors saying, hey, here's where the entrepreneur needs help, here's what's happening. And every 12 months, usually pretty much entrepreneurs come back. And for you to really know when is the right time to reinvest or not, the data shows that those who really reinvest, especially when they wait till there's a strategic acquirer, and therefore diversify their risk, not just on number of investments, but knowing which ones they do follow on rounds, are the ones, that's the 4th piece. So it's all about deal flow, due diligence, investment building, portfolio building, and then adding value, reinvesting, and really helping the entrepreneur exit, or for you to find a good exit. It took me 14 years, but now that's why I'd go beyond. That's why we're so happy. We're from the beginning. I took notes on everything, and so we have we're building. We already have videos, we have webinars, we have in-person meetings, and now we're going to be able to expand that tremendously and make it accessible to tens of hundreds of thousands of individuals in Europe, thanks to the ESOL project. But it's really about learning by doing. That's why it's all about, find a community where you can learn while you're making small ticket investments. Doing only learning or only putting the tickets, to me, is not the road to success. I am passionate, as you can see.
Do we have other questions from the audience? So perhaps, we have one over there.
Good evening. What do you think about the competition in funding system that is between loans or equity, obviously, that is typical for the stuff that we are talking about on this stage, with the new models in terms of technology and people involved in that we call ICO, means initial coin offerings, that we assist for 1,000 in the last year for cryptocurrency. That is in some way a very market-driven way to show to the people that have capacity in terms of marketing, technology, finance, and human skills to attract new capital. Yes, a competition, because now something new, a new business, a new entrepreneur can decide instead to have loans or some equity support from business angels to do this way. And that's what happens in 1,000 cases in the last year.
From my point of view, I think the different financing options there are alternatives, there are different options for different people. So not everyone, and that's why alternative financing is a good route to consider apart from the traditional ways, because different people will want to address funding differently, raise funds differently. Each person can have decide on which route to take, depending on their beliefs, their model, and their needs at the time. So I think it is, yes, competition between the different models, but they also complement each other in some ways. So different people will use different methods, but as we also mentioned, there are some ways that you can complement each other. So, for example, crowdfunding, raising crowdfunding could help you validate the idea and have actually a good client base, and assess the quality of your idea, how well-formed it is, the reception it gets in the market, to then use that response to go into and attract other business angels, venture capitalists, or issue an offering through other means. So I think different options are, yes, competing with each other, but that's the beauty of it, because more people have more choice.
Okay, just one.
In our case, for more established companies, the Fusion program is very, very popular. For example, and we would like government to invest more money in R&I. For example, for the CVP, we have lots of applicants, but we just choose one for every smart specialization area. And then for the TDP, we just choose 4 or 5 maximum. So we're missing on some very good projects. We encourage them to then reapply for the next call. But obviously, so if government gives in more money for R&I, then there's a bigger pot from where we can invest in these companies.
I think for the sake of time, Kasia,
I just want to, because I forgot to tell you where you can find the study that I mentioned. So you can access the website Crowdfunding for Innovation, for innovation, and then you can find all the information about alternative finance for research and innovation.
Thank you very much for this piece of information. So I think it's already time to close this very first day here in Malta. So I would like to give the floor to Stefan Waki, please.
Thank you. Very informative panel. I just wanted to make 2 short announcements. We resume tomorrow morning at 8:30. But tonight we have a gala dinner at 7:30 sharp in the reception, because we need to walk all together towards the venue, which is not very far, but we need to all do it as a group. So please do not miss the meeting point and the time, 7:30 in the reception. And then enjoy your evening, and we will resume, like I said, tomorrow morning at 8:30. Thank you very much.